Hi guys, and welcome back to the IELTS course. In today's lesson, we'll learn about new part of the IELTS exam and we'll learn about listening module. I will give you a brief overview to the IELTS listening module and things you need to know, but we'll specifically focus on sections 1 and 2 and how to complete these two sections successfully. And now we are going to review our IELTS listening module. Before we start learning different strategies and tips, I would like to give you a brief overview to the listening section. In the IELTS exam, you'll have 4 sections and 40 total questions. You'll be given 30 minutes to listen to the recordings and take notes and answer the questions. And last 10 minutes, you'll be given to transfer your answers to your answer sheet. In the IELTS test, you'll see 4 different sections, and in section 1 is going to be a conversation within a social situation. Your section 2 is going to be about a monologue on a general subject. Section 3 is going to be about a conversation between up to 4 people with an educational or training context. And the last section of the test is a section 4, which is a monologue, lecture, or academic talk. Most of the time, Section 3 and 4 are the most difficult ones for the students, so you have to really try to do your best when you are completing sections 1 and 2. Also, you'll see different types of tasks in your IELTS listening test, such as note completion, gap fill, short answer, table completion, multiple choice. Most of the time it has 3 different options, A, B, C, but sometimes you might see A, B, C, D as well. Also, you might have tasks such as sentence completion and labeling a diagram. Again, in listening test, you will have 4 sections, 40 total questions, and 40 minutes to complete this entire task. And here I'm going to explain what type of task you are going to have in each section and what kind of strategies we are going to learn. For example, during our course, we are going to learn general strategies for listening for words and listening for numbers. And we'll also learn specific strategies for each section. For example, in section 1, which is about conversation, we are going to learn how to complete a form, complete a table, choose answers from a list. In the section 2, which is going to be about a talk, we are going to learn how to complete sentences, label a diagram, plan or map, and also give a short answer. In our section 3, it's going to be about discussion. We're going to review how to choose answers from a multiple choices, label a diagram, and match words and phrases. And our final section 4 is going to be about a talk or lecture. And here I'm going to explain how to classify words or statements, complete notes, and complete a flowchart. And now we are going to review our first strategy of the listening test, which is a general strategy, and it's going to be about listening for words. Remember, when you are listening to different recordings in the IELTS test, you have to use the questions you have on your handout to focus your attention on the keywords as you listen. Remember, the most important part here is also to circle the keywords. And the most important tip is for you to remember that keywords are often stressed, and you need to listen for words that are stressed. And as you know, stressed words always sound a little bit louder than the rest of the words. So here we have an example about a similar task. So here we have a following question. Choose 2 things that are included in the price of the hotel room. So in this case, the word 2 is emphasized. So you have 5 different options, A, B, C, D, and E. So from A, B, C, D, and E, 5 options, you have to pick only 2 things. So please pay attention when you are listening and circle the keywords such as this one. So your keyword in this question would be 2 and included in the hotel room. So make sure you're listening carefully and always circling the keywords. It will help you to stay focused. Our next general strategy is listening for numbers. Our strategy for this task is to be familiar with different ways to express numbers. Remember that taking notes is very important, and whenever you hear a number, make sure to do that. Also keep in mind that when we have a long number, the intonation rises and then falls at the last number. Whether the number is an identification number, a date, or a price, there are different ways the number can be said. Look at our following example about dates. As you can see, November 24th, 2013 can be said in two different ways, as November 24th, 2013, or it can be said as November 24, 2013. And now we're going to review how to say price, time, decimals, telephone numbers, credit card numbers, and ID numbers in different ways. So as you see on the slide, we have price 1333, and it can be said differently. So you have to be aware of that, and you have to be able to recognize that number. So as you see, it can be said as the following: $13.33, or the speaker can say 1333. Next one we have time, which is 2:45. So the first example we have it at 2:45. It can be also said as 2:45 or 2:45. So next one we have, it's a decimals. So for example, when we have decimals, we can say it a little bit differently. So you have to make sure you know how to recognize this number. So for example, here we have 3.75. Also, we can say it as a 3 3/4, or we can also say it as 3 3/4. And the last one we have, it's about telephone numbers, credit card numbers, and ID numbers. So here, for example, you have a number, and this number can be said as the following: +150575 3948, or we can say it as +1505 475 3948. So you have to make sure before you take your IELTS test, you are aware of the numbers and how they can be said differently. IELTS Listening Module, Strategies and Tips, Part 2. And now we are going to learn our specific strategies for the Section 1. As you remember, our Section 1 is going to be about conversations. And the first task we are going to review is completing a form. The most important thing to remember when you're completing a form is paying attention to the words before and after the gap. Make sure to listen for the name and address which appear before the gap. So for example, here we have an example below with a name and address. As you see, we have a name, Juan, Gap, and John's. So in this case, as you can tell, we have to listen for the first name of John's. So for example, when you hear first name and then it will be followed by John's, you know that's information you need to write down. The next example we have address 154, 2, and gap. So whenever you hear 154, the following information you're going to write down in your gap. And remember that the order of the gaps in the form will follow the conversation. And now we're going to review how to complete a table in the Section 1. Remember, before you listen, you need to circle the keywords around the gaps, and then you need to listen to the conversation and complete the form below. In the IELTS exam, you'll be asked to write no more than 3 words and or a number for each answer. So this is your task, to read carefully and identify how many words you are allowed to write down. So as you see, we have a table below, and you have a title that states the following: Sandington Hotel, reservation form. You are given 5 numbers which are followed by the gaps that you have to fill out. For example, as you see, before number 1, you have 2 words, guest name. And then you have a gap and Wiggins. Wiggins, it's a last name. And when you are listening to your recording, you have to write down and identify what kind of first name goes before this last name. The second one is already done for you. For example, you have arrival date, then June 23rd. And the next one, it's number 2, you have to fill out is length of stay. So length of stay represents number. So you have to listen carefully for how many days a person who is trying to reserve a room is trying to stay there. Maybe it's 3 days, maybe it can be 5 days, 10 days, so you have to listen and identify this number. Then we have room type. So room type, it's like logically you can ask yourself, what kind of room types do hotels have? So think about that and be prepared to listen for this type of information. The next one we have is the room preferences. Room preferences, so here you have to be very careful because you have number 4 gap, but then you have also the word view. So that has to be word before the word view that you have to write down. And it has to make sense when you write this word down, and it has to be grammatically correct as well. So be very careful when you're listening for this information. And the last point we have, it's number 5, which is going to be credit card number. As you remember, we discussed previously about the numbers and different ways we can say the numbers. So you have to make sure you know all the different ways how numbers can be said, and you are listening carefully for these numbers. Important tips here to remember are not to write for words, because here in the IELTS test you are being asked to write only 3 words. You have to make sure you are using your pencil, then circling the keywords and reading and predicting what you are going to hear in your recordings. And now we're going to review how to complete a table in the listening test. The most important strategy here to keep in mind is circling the keywords and paraphrasing them. Also, you have to make sure when you are taking your notes, you write them down in a column for each speaker. This will help you to stay focused and not get confused. Also remember, paraphrasing will focus your attention on the subject of the conversation. Remember also that speakers might not use the exact same words in the conversation, so you should be able to hear some different words that have the same meaning. And as you see, we have an example here, and you have a question that states the following: which 2 activities is the guest interested in? And we have a list A through E, and we have a paraphrase words that you might hear in the listening recording. So for example, you have A, water sports. You might have a list A, water sports, but the speaker in the listening might say something like swimming, boating, water skiing. Also, you might have something like hikes, but the speaker might not mention the word hikes, but say walks and climbing. So you have to make sure you know how to hear these words with different words. And when you are given 30 seconds to prepare before listening, that's the thing you have to do. You have to try to paraphrase the answer choices you have and be ready to hear these ideas with different words. IELTS Listening Module Strategies and Tips, Part 3. And now we are going to talk about our section 2, which is going to be about talk. The most important strategy here to remember is circling the keywords and paying attention to the words around the gaps. Also, you have to keep in mind that you need to pay attention to the grammatical form of the words around the gaps as well. And you have to also determine what kind of words are needed to complete the gap. Sometimes it can be a noun, sometimes it can be a modifier such as adjective, adverb, or maybe it's a verb or preposition. So make sure you look at the gaps and you read the complete sentence and understand what kind of information and what kind of grammatical form of the word you need to write down. So for example, we have an example below in here, and let's take a look. In the IELTS exam you ask, listen to the talk and complete sentences. Write no more than 3 words and or a number for each answer. So the most important part in here is to read carefully how many words you are allowed to write down, because sometimes they ask you to write only 1 word, so you need to be very careful. And as you see, we have 3 different statements, 3 different sentences in other words. And number 1, you have a gap, then it's followed by of Taipei 101 began in 1999. So when you're completing this kind of task, read it carefully. So you can ask yourself, what of Taipei 101 began in 1999? So as you see, you need a noun in this case. And make sure you do the same with the following sentences and read them carefully and identify for what type of information you need to listen when you're listening to your recordings. And now we're going to review how to label a diagram, plan, or map. Remember, when you're completing this type of task, you need to look at the words that are on the diagram, plan, or map. These type of words will help you focus your attention while listening. And that's very important while you're listening to this type of task. You paying attention to direction words or location words. They will help you identify specific spots on the plan or map. And also, you have to make sure that you listen carefully for the starting point so you can follow the conversation smoothly. There are important expressions for direction or location you need to know. For example, these are words such as in the middle, above, to the left, around the corner from, at the bottom of the map, north, south, east, west, next to, adjacent to, and so on. There are so many different words, and also it's very important to know the preposition of places such as behind, in front of, past, beyond, on the other side, across, or on the corner of. So make sure you know these type of words, and while you are listening, you're paying attention to them because they will help you to focus your attention and go back to your diagram and understand the diagram and what kind of information you need to listen carefully. So, and that's how we complete our labeling a diagram type of task. And here you need to look at the diagram and read what you'll have to do. You may be asked to match labels with letters on the diagram, or you may be asked to write labels for different points on the diagram. So just make sure you do not write more words than required amount. We discussed it previously. And just listen to your conversation, and before you do so, make sure you analyze and learn the map or diagram you have. So IELTS test is asking you to label the plan below and write no more than 2 words and or a number for each answer. So make sure you are not writing 3 words, you can only write 1 or 2. And for example, here you have a map and you see how we have a shopping complex, apartments, Maple Avenue, Green Acre Street, library, and we have 3, 1, 2, 3. So you see like gap fills that you have to fill out. And all these words are not here without a purpose. Keep in mind that. And then you need to read them. And it means you'll hear them in recording whenever you feel that you're not focusing, but you hear the word shopping complex. So try to go with your pencil and try to actually draw on your map. That will help you to stay focused. That's what I do all the time too. And yeah, so make sure also that you are very good with your directions like west, east, north, south. So this is very important. Sometimes you use these directions as well in the test. Our final task we're going to review today is giving a short answer. Remember that you need to circle the question and keywords to determine the kind of answer you need to give. Also remember the order of answers follows the talk. If you see the question beginning with who, remember you listen for a name or an occupation. You listen to something that refers to a person. Also, by studying the following lists of words will help you to be more prepared for your upcoming test. So for example, here we have a question words that beginning with who, and type of answer will be a person or name. If your question begins with what, so you know that you are going to hear and write about a thing. Where refers to a place, when refers to a time. When your question begins with why, it means it refers to a reason. How much or how long, it's a quantity. And how often, that means it's a time again. So make sure you study and identify these type of words, and that will help you to be more prepared. And now we're going to review the most important listening tips that can help you do better while completing this task. Remember that you need to stay focused and use your pencil to take notes while being tested. Another important point to keep in mind is circling keywords and predicting your answers. Also remember, reading directions carefully is very important because sometimes you'll be asked to write only 1 word, sometimes You can be asked to write 2 words or 3 words. So you have to make sure you identify how many words you need to write down in your answer sheet. Another important point to keep in mind also is paying attention to distractors, especially with numbers. Write what's said first and change if needed. Sometimes the speaker can say one number and then he can go back and change his mind. So you have to make sure you write down all the numbers you hear and paying attention which number you need to keep and write down in your answer sheet. And the most important one as well, it's your spelling. So make sure you are practicing a lot your spelling, because if you misspell some words, your answer choice is going to be incorrect. Even the word is correct, but if it's not spelled correctly, your answer is going to be marked wrong. So make sure you keep in mind these tips, and I'm sure they're going to help you a lot during your test. And now we are going to review our recap and the most important points we studied in our today's lesson. As you remember, you'll have 40 minutes to complete listening task, and you listen for 4 sections and answer 40 questions. You'll also listen to a conversation in the section 1, and you listen to a monologue in section 2. Remember that you listen to a conversation between up to 4 people with an educational training context in the section 3, and your section 4 is going to be about a lecture about a specific topic. And remember, most importantly, that you'll hear everything only one time, so you have to make sure you are paying attention, taking notes, and circling your keywords and staying focused. Hi guys, and welcome back to our IELTS course. In our today's lesson, we are going to learn about section 3 and 4, and also we'll review different strategies and tips for these 2 sections. Before we'll begin learning about section 3 and 4, I would like to go back and review with you what we studied previously. As you remember, IELTS listening module has 4 sections and 40 total questions. You'll be given 30 minutes to listen to the recordings, answer the questions, and extra 10 minutes to transfer your answers to your answer sheet. As you remember, we had 4 sections, and section 1 is going to be about a conversation within a social situation. Section 2 is going to be a monologue on the general subject. Our section 3 is going to be a conversation between up to 4 people with an educational or training context. And our final section 4 is going to be a monologue as a lecture or academic talk. You'll hear also different task types. You'll be completing them in the IELTS listening test. They are going to be as the following ones: note completion, gap fill, short answer, table completion, the most popular multiple choice questions, sentence completion, and labeling a diagram. So that's what we have for the listening module. And today we'll continue learning about section 3 and 4. Now we are going to review section 3. It is going to be about discussion. The main strategy here to remember is listening for details. Remember, a speaker may correct himself or herself, so you need to pay attention to the possible changes in opinions and facts. To focus on the details, circle the keywords in the question or statement and keywords in the multiple choice options as well. Listen for these words or similar words in the discussion. Sometimes, as you remember, speakers do not say exactly the same words, but they paraphrase their ideas. Listen carefully, because a speaker may also alter what he or she says. Here we have an example from authentic IELTS test. For example, speaker might say the following: I left on June 25th. No, it was the 26th. I arrived on the 25th. But returned on the 26th. So see, it can be a little bit confusing, so you need to really pay attention and understand what kind of question you have. When the person arrived or when the person left. So make sure you are listening carefully and taking your notes. And now you can see our example for the discussion type of task. What you have to do here is to circle the keywords, and in my case I highlighted them for you, and listen to the audio and answer the question. So for example, our first question is asking you, what does a student say about the introductory Spanish class? So when you highlight the keywords, so for example, student is a very important word, and introductory Spanish. Also pay attention that it's not only Spanish but introductory Spanish. Maybe student is going to talk about different types of Spanish classes such as middle level or intermediate or advanced, so make sure that you are paying attention to modifier you have before the word Spanish. And also, as I mentioned earlier, so you have your multiple choices A, B, C. So you need to pay attention and highlight or circle the keywords. In this case, he took it already, so took already, too easy, and doesn't have room. So doesn't have room, think about a paraphrase as well. When someone says doesn't have room, it means his schedule doesn't have room. So that means that his schedule is full. So they might say it differently in the listening recording. And the following two questions are similar to our first one. So make sure before you start listening to the recording that you take notes, circle the keywords, and listen carefully. Now we're going to review how to label a diagram. Try to label the diagram without hearing the audio. This will focus your attention on what you need to listen. Also try to pay attention to the directions. And remember not to write more words than required. For example, in the following diagram and task, you are required to write only 2 words. If you write 3 words, your response automatically will be incorrect. So make sure to write 1 or 2 words when you are completing a labeling diagram kind of task. Matching words and phrases. When we have this task, we need to read the list to make an assumption about the topic of the discussion. Also, paraphrasing the items in the list is very important too, because it will prepare you for the discussion and what you are going to hear. The most important tip here to remember is that some items in the list may not be mentioned in the discussion, or they may be mentioned in different order. So here we have an example from A through D, and you have a paraphrase on the side. So for example, in our A, it states the following: it requires weekend hours. So you might hear something like work on Saturdays and Sundays. And for example, B, the salary is too low, and instead you might hear something, it doesn't pay much. C, it's far from his home, it requires a long drive. And D, it's already been filled, they've already hired someone. So as you see, paraphrase is very important, and that can prepare you for the discussion you are going to hear. Also, make sure that you are preparing yourself and thinking about different ways of saying some things, because in the listening part, it's not going to be exactly like you see in A, B, C, D. Alright guys, so look at the following example we have from the Authentic IELTS test. And the IELTS test is asking you, what does Elizabeth do in each one of her classes? Choose your answers from the box. You are given A, B, C, D. For example, A, write papers, B, give a presentation, C, go on the field trips, and D, read a lot. And you also see paraphrase that I have written about these answers. So as I mentioned previously to you, that you're not going to hear sometimes the same exact words like writing papers. It can be stated as researching or writing essays. Giving a presentation can be said as giving a speech. So you also have 3 following classes: economics, sociology, and geology. If you have a similar task like this one, all you have to do, for example, economics, and you are going to write down which one, A, B, C, D. In economics class, she is writing papers maybe, so you're going to write down A. Sociology class, maybe she's going on the field trip, so for sociology you're going to write down C. And for example, geology, maybe she's reading a lot, or maybe she's writing papers as well, so it can be an A or D. As you can see, some answers can be repeated. So for example, economics and geology both can be an A. Just pay attention and listen carefully. IELTS Listening Module, Strategies and Tips, Part 2. And now we are going to review our final section of the listening test, which is section 4, about a talk or lecture. In this section, we are going to review how to classify words or statements. When you're completing the task such as this one, You need to read the categories you have, then read the words quickly. Also, it's very important to determine for you a link between a category and a word before you listen. However, you have to keep in mind that you need to write what the speaker says, not what you think. And also remember that you may use the categories more than one time. So now we are going to review our example from the IELTS test, and the task is asking you to do the following. So which features are characteristics of which type of wetland? You need to choose a correct letter. So as you see, we have wetlands and we have ABC, 3 different names. Don't worry if you have no idea the meaning of the words. It doesn't really matter sometimes. And you have the following: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, acidic water, grasses, shrubs, mosses, and trees. So even though sometimes you do not know some words, please do not worry about that. Sometimes you'll be able to understand even without the knowledge of some words. And a lot of times actually in IELTS, your speaker is going to give you a definition. And actually it happens a lot in the reading part too. So what you have to do in this case, whenever you hear acidic water, and then you might hear word swamp many times, so you're going to write down 1B. And then for example, you might hear something like grasses, and then you'll hear bog, so that's going to be 2C. And sometimes some of them can be repeated. For example, acidic water, grasses, shrubs, they all can be swamp. So that's why you can repeat, you can use, some categories over and over again. So, and this is type of task we have in the section 4. And now we are going to review how to complete notes in the section 4. When you are completing this type of task, you need to circle the keywords in the notes provided. Also, you have to make sure you try to guess the focus of the talk or lecture. And remember, the notes are just notes and they are not necessarily sentences. So the ideas can be incomplete, and that's totally normal. They might not include some prepositions, articles, verbs, or other grammatical clues. It's a very important point to keep in mind. Also remember that the notes follow the order of the talk, and if you miss one gap, you just need to jump to the next one and continue listening and completing the gaps. So here we have an example, and you are being asked to write no more than 3 words for each answer. Before you start listening, make sure you are reading the notes you have and you actually understand what the notes are about. So for example, here we have a topic about color blindness. And as you see, color blindness, and then you have the following words such as the inability to, and you have to fill out the inability to do what. As you see, in this case, we need a verb. The next sentence we have, the most common form is to and gap color blindness. And as you see, it's describing what kind of color blindness. So you have to listen for the adjective that will be describing the most common form of color blindness. And it's very important to pay attention to the following words we have. So for example, here we have causes, and as you see, we have 3 causes. So you have genes and you have exposure to chemicals. So that means you need to listen carefully to the 3rd cause of color blindness. And now we're going to review our final strategies and tips for the listening section 4. And it's actually our final strategies and tips for the entire listening task. So we're going to review how to complete a flowchart. When you have a task like this one, you have to circle the keywords in the chart and ask yourself what the chart is about and try to complete the chart without listening. Doing so will help you be a careful and a better listener. So make sure you examine your chart and then you circle the keywords and try to understand what kind of information you need to fill it out with. Also for the tips, notice the grammar of the words in the chart. The words you write in the gap should match the grammar of the words. So it means if you have a statement and then you have to fill out the statement with some words, then it means it has to be grammatically correct. Let's take a look at the following example we have, and here you are being asked to write no more than 3 words. So our topic is indirect solar water heater, and you have three different statements. Make sure you read them carefully and circle the keywords. So for example, for number 1, we have the antifreeze solution is 1 gap in the solar collector. So the most important words here are antifreeze solution and solar collector. So make sure you are listening for the words like antifreeze solution, and solution can be maybe said differently using different synonyms, but you have to be very careful when you're listening. Maybe you're going to hear a couple of things, so write them down and then go back and try to fill your gaps with the words you caught while listening and see which one grammatically fits in this context. And that's how you're going to complete this type of task. And don't forget, this is one of the most challenging part in the IELTS exam. It's a listening section 4. So always do your best, and if you skip some of the statements and you didn't get information, that's totally fine. Just make sure you don't give up and continue listening carefully. And now we are going to review our final recap for the listening task. As you remember, you'll be given 40 minutes to complete listening task, 30 minutes listening to the recordings, and 10 minutes transferring your answers to your answer sheets. You'll have 40 questions in total, and your section 4 is going to be about a lecture, which is going to last between 3 to 5 minutes, and section 3 is going to be about a conversation between up to 4 people with an educational training context. And remember, you'll hear everything only one time, so you have to be very careful and make sure you take notes and listen carefully and prepare yourself and predict information. Also remember that the notes follow the order of the talk. That means if you miss one gap, you need to move on to the next one. And this is very important that you are listening carefully, and even though you miss some gaps, it's totally fine. Just make sure you are trying to focus again and listen carefully. A lot of times students give up after they miss a couple of gaps, but it doesn't mean you are going to score badly. So make sure you are continuing listening and you are trying to refocus your attention. IELTS Listening Module Strategies and Tips, Part 2. And now we are going to review our final section of the listening test, which is section 4 about a talk or lecture. In this section, we are going to review how to classify words or statements. When you're completing the task such as this one, you need to read the categories you have, then read the words quickly. Also, it's very important to determine for you a link between a category and a word before you listen. However, you have to keep in mind that you need to write what the speaker says, not what you think. And also remember that you may use the categories more than one time. So now we are going to review our example from the IELTS test, and the task is asking you to do the following. So which features are characteristics of which type of wetland? You need to choose a correct letter. So as you see, we have wetlands and we have ABC, 3 different names. Don't worry if you have no idea the meaning of the words. It doesn't really matter sometimes. And you have the following 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, acidic water, grasses, shrubs, mosses, and trees. So even though sometimes you do not know some words, please do not worry about that. Sometimes you'll be able to understand even without the knowledge of some words. And a lot of times actually in IELTS, your speaker is going to give you a definition, and actually it happens a lot in the reading part too. So what you have to do in this case, whenever you hear acidic water, and then you might hear word swamp many times, so you're going to write down 1B. And then for example, you might hear something like grasses, and then you'll hear bog, so that's gonna be 2C. And sometimes some of them can be repeated. For example, acidic water, grass, or shrubs, they all can be swamp. So that's why you can repeat, you can use, some categories over and over again. So, and this is type of task we have in the section 4. And now we are going to review how to complete notes in the section 4. When you are completing this type of task, you need to circle the keywords in the notes provided. Also, you have to make sure you try to guess the focus of the talk or lecture. And remember, the notes are just notes and they are not necessarily sentences. So the ideas can be incomplete, and that's totally normal. They might not include some prepositions, articles, verbs, or other grammatical clues. It's a very important point to keep in mind. Also remember that the notes follow the order of the talk, and if you miss one gap, you just need to jump to the next one and continue listening and completing the gaps. So here we have an example, and you are being asked to write no more than 3 words for each answer. Before you start listening, make sure you are reading the notes you have and you actually understand what the notes are about. So for example, here we have a topic about color blindness. And as you see color blindness, and then you have the following words such as the inability to, and you have to fill out the inability to do what. As you see, in this case, we need a verb. The next sentence we have, the most common form is to and gap color blindness. And as you see, it's describing what kind of color blindness. So you have to listen for the adjective that will be describing the most common form of color blindness. And it's very important to pay attention to the following words we have. So for example, here we have causes, and as you see, we have 3 causes. So you have genes and you have exposure to chemicals. So that means you need to listen carefully to the 3rd cause of color blindness. And now we're going to review our final strategies and tips for the listening section 4. And it's actually our final strategies and tips for the entire listening task. So we're going to review how to complete a flowchart. When you have a task like this one, you have to circle the keywords in the chart and ask yourself what the chart is about and try to complete the chart without listening. Doing so will help you be a careful and a better listener. So make sure you examine your chart and then you circle the keywords and try to understand what kind of information you need to fill it out with. Also for the tips, notice the grammar of the words in the chart. The words you write in the gap should match the grammar of the words. So it means if you have a statement and then you have to fill out the statement with some words, then it means it has to be grammatically correct. Let's take a look at the following example we have, and here you are being asked to write no more than 3 words. So our topic is indirect solar water heater, and you have 3 different statements. Make sure you read them carefully and circle the keywords. So for example, for number 1, we have the antifreeze solution is 1 gap in the solar collector. So the most important words here are antifreeze solution and solar collector. So make sure you are listening for the words like antifreeze solution, and solution can be maybe said differently using different synonyms, but you have to be very careful when you're listening. Maybe you're going to hear a couple of things, so write them down and then go back and try to fill your gaps with the words you caught while listening and see which one grammatically fits in this context. And that's how you're going to complete this type of task. And don't forget, this is one of the most challenging part in the IELTS exam. It's a listening section 4. So always do your best, and if you skip some of the statements and you didn't get information, that's totally fine. Just make sure you don't give up and continue listening carefully. And now we are going to review our final recap for the listening task. As you remember, you'll be given 40 minutes to complete listening task, 30 minutes listening to the recordings, and 10 minutes transferring your answers to your answer sheets. You'll have 40 questions in total, and your section 4 is going to be about a lecture, which is going to last between 3 to 5 minutes, and section 3 is going to be about a conversation between up to 4 people with an educational training context. And remember, you'll hear everything only one time, so you have to be very careful and make sure you take notes and listen carefully and prepare yourself and predict information. Also remember that the notes follows the order of the talk. That means if you miss one gap, you need to move on to the next one. And this is very important that you are listening carefully, and even though you miss some gaps, it's totally fine. Just make sure you are trying to focus again and listen carefully. A lot of times students give up after they miss a couple of gaps, but it doesn't mean you are going to score badly. So make sure you are continuing listening and you are trying to refocus your attention. Hi guys, and welcome back to our IELTS course, and we are going to learn today about our IELTS speaking section. We'll review different strategies and tips and how to complete this section, and we'll learn about part 1, 2, and 3. And before learning about each part of the IELTS speaking test, we're going to have a brief overview. So in your part 1, you are going to have general questions about yourself and everyday situations. So you'll have everyday vocabulary that you can use at home, at supermarket, at school, and so on. And also you'll be using different tenses, verb tenses, that you apply in your daily life. Your part 2 is going to be about a speak on a topic given by the examiner. So this is a very important part of the test because you'll get to show your ability of speaking English for a longer period of time. You need to introduce your talk, you need to pay attention to question words, and also you should be able to express your personal feelings. And the final part 3 is going to be about a conversation on abstract topics, where you have to do the same to introduce your topic and support your topic with supporting details and make some clarifications if you have to. So this is our brief overview to the IELTS speaking test. And in the following slides, we will be learning about part 1. And now we are going to discuss our part 1, which is going to be about everyday vocabulary words. Remember, when you're completing this type of task, it is very important for you to know vocabulary about daily topics that will help you to talk about yourself and everyday situations such as work, study, hometown, favorite food, hobbies, your favorite pets, so things like that. You have to make sure you are familiar with these topics and you know what kind of words to use when you talk about them. Important things to remember here also, not giving short answers. So make sure you do not answer with yes, no, I don't know type of responses, because at this point your examiner won't be able to see how much you can speak in English and how well you can speak English. So make sure you know these topics and your response is at least 2-3 sentences long. And remember, it's very important not to memorize your answers, because sometimes when students memorize the answers, they don't sound natural. So this is one of the biggest mistakes. Even though sometimes you make grammatical mistakes, it's totally fine. The most important point when you are completing your part 1 to be natural and be able to talk about general topics about everyday life. And now we are going to talk about verb tenses and their importance in the speaking test. Remember, you need to pay close attention to the verb tense that the examiner uses. Also listen for the tense markers in the examiner's question, because this will help you determine in which tense you need to speak. There are some common tense markers we have on the slide, and the first one we see about present tense. When you hear the words now, at this moment, presently, these days, usually, and questions beginning with do and does, that means you need to speak in the present tense. If you hear the following words such as in the past, when you were younger, when you were a child, before, or question beginning with did, that means you need to speak in the past tense. And the next one is the future. And if you have to speak in the future, you need to pay attention to the words such as in the future, in a few years, later, or questions beginning with will, and are you going to. So pay close attention to these tense markers and always listen carefully how the question begins when the examiner speaks. This will help you determine in which tense you need to talk. Here you have part 1 example prompt. In your part 1, your examiner is going to ask you about yourself and the things you like to do daily. So the questions can be about your daily life, such as your hobbies, your favorite subject, about your family. You never know what is going to be on the test, but these are common topics you need to be prepared for. So your examiner, he or she might announce a topic. So for example, he or she might say, let's talk about your hometown or village. And then he or she can ask you follow-up questions about town or village. For example, they can ask you, what kind of place is it? What's the most interesting part of the town or village where you live? What kind of jobs do the people in your town village do? And would you say it's a good place to live, and why? So examiner can ask you different questions about 2 or 3 topics. More questions he or she asks you, it means you are not probably talking enough and your responses are short. So make sure when you're answering, you are not having responses with yes or no question like answers. So try not to respond with yes, no, I don't know, or maybe. So make sure your responses are complete and you have at least 2-3 sentences. So that's all we have for the part 1. And the prompt you see, it's an actual prompt from the authentic IELTS test. So you need to be prepared to talk about everyday vocabulary, everyday activities, and of course about yourself. IELTS Speaking Strategies and Tips, Part 2. And now we're going to talk about Part 2. In Part 2, you have to speak on a topic given by examiner. You'll be given a card with various questions, and then you have to prepare for 1 minute and take notes before start speaking. Once 1 minute is up, you'll introduce your topic and you'll speak for 2 minutes until the examiner will ask you to stop. So make sure you speak as much as possible and don't end your speaking until the examiner asks you to do so. Remember, introducing your topic is very important because it will help your examiner follow your ideas and know what you're going to talk about. So, for example, you can begin your speech by saying something like this: I'm going to talk about, or I'm going to discuss about. So, make sure you introduce your topic using such words. And also keep in mind, using transition words are very important. Transition words we have such as first of all, however, for example, finally, and so on. So make sure you're using them because that will help your examiner to understand your ideas better, and also that will help him to follow them better as well. Also important point here to remember is that you need to talk a lot and you need to make sure you are speaking spontaneously. So you are not memorizing some specific sentences or vocabulary words, but using your own words. And now we are going to discuss our part 2 example prompt. As you remember, in part 2 you'll be given candidate task card. You'll be asked to do the following as an example we have on the slide. Describe something you own which is very important to you. You should say where you got it from, how long you have had it, what you use it for, and explain what is important, why it is important to you. So when you have a task like this, you'll have 1 minute to prepare before you speak. And then once 1 minute is up, examiner will ask you to start speaking. So you'll have 2 minutes to speak and show your ability of speaking English. So you should try to speak as much as possible, and it's very important point to remember that you should answer all the questions that are presented in the card, such as where you got the gift or the things that you possess that is important to you, how long you have had it, so present a number, maybe 2 months, maybe 5 years, and what you use it for. So give an example and explain what you use it for, and of course give some reasons why this is an important thing to you. Once you're done speaking, you will have some rounding off questions that examiner will ask you about the topic you talked. So they might sound like this: is it valuable in terms of money, and would it be easy to replace? So remember that you should not give yes or no, I don't know, maybe kind of answers, and you should speak in 2-3 complete sentences. And now let's take a look how to take notes. For example, you'll have a candidate card that will ask you to do the following. Describe a trip you have taken recently. You should say where you went, who went with you, and why you went there. So when you're taking your notes, make sure you are not writing complete sentences. You only write down a couple of words that will help you to remember your ideas fast. So for example, where, you can write down something like about 40 kilometers from home, and who, my entire family, why, visit to our grandparents. So remember, you shouldn't write complete sentences because while speaking and when you try to read them, you'll get more confused. So you only need to see the words, the keywords that will help you to remember your ideas and continue to speak about your topic. So taking notes should be real fast, and you have to make sure you are covering the most important points like where, who, and why. Now we're going to discuss about personal feelings. Showing your personal feelings is very important during your part 2. And remember, in the last part of the part 2, you'll be asked to explain something about your personal feelings about the topic. For example, why it is important to you, or why you like it, or maybe why you dislike it. So the main strategy here is to think of 3 logical responses to the questions, then say a couple of sentences about each one. So for example, you have a reason 1, why you like it, then you present supporting details and show an example. And remember, do not memorize your response. You should try to talk naturally as much as possible and try not to be nervous. And here we have example of students' response for the part 2. Read carefully, and this will give you an idea how to respond to this type of task. IELTS Speaking Strategies and Tips, Part 3. Now we are going to talk about our Part 3, which is going to be about conversation on abstract topics. Remember, the examiner might ask you a few questions on a topic from Part 2. If there is time left, then she or he will make a transition to Part 3. The purpose of Part 3 is to get your opinion on abstract topics related to the Part 2. So for example, you'll have some personal questions in Part 2, such as describing your favorite holiday. Then the examiner might have a transition by saying the following sentences. You've just talked about holidays. Now I'd like to discuss this topic more generally. First, let's talk about the importance of observing holidays. So that's how he or she will make a transition to your Part 3. In Part 3, you'll have abstract questions. They might sound like this one. Do you think that is important to observe holidays? So remember, more you speak, less questions you get, so try to speak as much as possible and answer in complete 2-3 sentences. So try not to say yes or no. Remember, more you say yes or no, more questions you are going to receive. And if you feel confident to speak about certain topics, you can show your opinion, you can present your examples and maybe some experiences or reasons you have. So your abstract questions are going to be more specific and they are going to be related to your part 2. And now we are going to discuss about clarification. Sometimes you might hear some questions during your speaking test, but you might not be able to understand them. So that's a good idea to clarify the questions that the examiner asks. Remember, you should always directly answer a question. However, if you are not sure you understand the question, ask for clarification. Don't give an answer that is not relevant to the question. Sometimes students, even though they do not understand the question, they still speak about something different. So make sure you don't make the same mistake and you ask for clarification. Asking for clarification also gives you extra time to think of a good answer. So this is a very helpful tool to brainstorm and think about a better response. When you're asking for clarification, you can use the following phrases you have in the box. So these are common phrases to ask for clarification, such as do you mean, do you want me to say, if I understand you correctly, you want to know and continue your idea. You're asking me if and you would like me to give you. So these are the type of phrases you can use for clarification. And remember, you do not need to remember them all. You just have to remember a couple of them, like 2 or 3, if you'd like to, and try to practice asking questions for clarifications. This will help you a lot during your IELTS speaking test. And now we're going to review our important speaking tips that can help you during your speaking test. The first one and the most important one is keep talking, because the examiner needs to hear you use English, so please do not be shy and show your ability of speaking English for a longer period of time. Avoid giving yes, no type of answers. Speak as much as possible in 2-3 sentences. Give 2-3 sentence type of response. And it's also important to keep in mind that everyone makes mistakes, and even native speakers make some grammatical mistakes. If you make some of them, it's totally fine. Just try not to dwell on that and worry about it too much, and just let it go and continue speaking as much as you can. Another important point to keep in mind is that you should not memorize responses. You need to sound spontaneous, natural, even though you make some little errors. So it's totally fine, but try not to memorize some responses that you find online or some specific phrases. It can confuse you even more in time of speaking. Also, don't worry about a particular part. For example, you remember we have part 1, part 2, part 3. Remember that your score is a composite of all 3 parts, not just one. So even though you don't, for example, you didn't do well on the part 1, always try to do better in the next part, okay? And also keep in mind about your preparation time. In part 2, you'll be given 1 minute. So make sure you read your card, you prepare yourself, and you think about what to say during that time. So this is very important. Sometimes students come to the test, they are given 1 minute, and they look at the questions they have just for maybe 5 seconds and they say, I'm ready. But you should actually take advantage of the time you have, prepare very well, and then speak for 2 minutes nonstop. And again, don't worry if the examiner stops you, because each part has a time limit. So if examiner stops you, it doesn't mean that you did something wrong or something went not well. It's totally fine. Just move on to the next part. And again, be enthusiastic, show your positivity, and I'm sure if you show your interest and you speak a lot, you are going to do very well on this part of the test. And now we are going to review our final slide, which is going to be a recap to the things we studied today. As you remember, you'll have 3 parts to complete your speaking section, and you'll be given 11 to 14 minutes. Remember, more you speak, longer your test is going to take. Less you speak, shorter the test is going to be. In your part 1, you'll have 4 to 5 minutes to speak, and your preparation time is going to be none, so it means you won't have any time to prepare. It's going to be an interview type of task. And task 2 is going to be 3 minutes, so you'll have 1 minute to prepare and 2 minutes to speak. Part 3 is going to be 4 to 5 minutes, and you'll have no preparation time. Most of the time it's a follow-up questions about your part 2. So that's what we have for our IELTS speaking, and you just have to keep in mind to be spontaneous and sound natural. Hi guys, and this is our final module for our listening and speaking course. Today we are going to review how to improve your listening and speaking skills and things you need to know in order to get better and be prepared for your IELTS test. And now we are going to begin our class by reviewing listening test tips. Remember, before taking your test, you have to make sure you are ready to listen. The moment you hear the words section 1, section 2, etc., you should be prepared and ready to listen for the instructions that are given to you. Listen for details about the information contained in the passage as well. For example, questions such as who, what, where, when, and why. Also, you have to keep in mind that learning how to predict is a very important strategy during your test. There are many types of IELTS listening question tasks, and make sure to know how to complete them before taking the test. Without this knowledge, it's going to be really challenging for you to complete listening task. In the listening test, you'll use 4 skills at once. You need to be able to do the following things: read the instructions and questions, listen for general information and specific information as well. And also you have to write the answers as you listen for the answers to the questions that follow. Remember, before each listening passage in the time given to you, look at each section in the test booklet and try to predict information in situations that you will hear. Knowing how to predict the number of people involved and what they might be doing or planning will ensure that you'll do great on this test and you'll answer most of the questions correctly. Also, try to predict what they might say and what the words they might use by reading the titles and reading the words you have on your handout. And here's a note that you need to remember, that in order to score well in the listening test, you need to develop the ability to think ahead. Learning how to predict will form the correct word association and help you hear the right words in the recording. So predicting is one of the most important things when it comes to your listening that can help you succeed and pass IELTS listening test successfully. And now let's discuss things you should keep in mind while taking your listening test. Remember that section 1 of the listening test is the easiest of the 4 sections. Also, each section becomes progressively more difficult. So section 1 is the easiest, section 2 is a little bit harder, and sections 3 and 4 are the most challenging ones. Also, if your English level is average or above average, you should have little trouble completing section 1. If you are seriously considering to study in an English-speaking country, you should be able to score 100 in this section. However, it is common to make mistakes in this section due to nervousness or lack of preparation. So make sure you practice in advance and you feel rested while you're taking your test. It is very important, and it really determines how focused you can stay while listening to the recordings. Practice listening for general understanding of the situation and for the specific keywords and phrases. Make sure to complete at least 3 practice tests before taking your IELTS exam. That will ensure you are prepared and you know exactly what to do while taking your test. Remember that the answers are often stressed and repeated. If you listen carefully to the recording, you'll notice that important information which almost always stressed and quite often repeated 2 or even 3 times. So when I say stressed, I mean the speaker says these words a little bit louder. He or she tries to emphasize these words. And a lot of time these words are actually correct answers. So let's take a look at our following example. So here we have conversation between George, someone named George, and clerk. So as you see, there are a couple of times you see how the word Paris was highlighted, so it's written in bold, and in this case Paris is a correct answer. IELTS listening and speaking. How to improve your listening and speaking skills, part 2. And now we're going to review one of the most important points in your IELTS listening test. It's knowing when to move on to the next section. In the IELTS listening test, each section is considered separately, and you are not being told when the next question in the section comes. When the passage is being played, you should be aware of the content of the next question as you listen for the answer to the current question. Also, if you don't think ahead to the next question and miss an answer, you might be unable to keep up with the recording. You could still be waiting for an answer that has already been given, so Make sure you examine what type of questions you have and you prepare yourself in advance and know the content of the upcoming question. In the listening test, you are going to hear various signal phrases and words. These signal phrases and words can help you determine when to move on to the next question. They might sound like the following phrases below. And now we will, before I move on to, and what about, so these are type of phrases you might have. As you see, we have different expression. This is just the one example that we have, and you have to make sure you can recognize them because they will help you determine when you need to move on to the next question. Remember, usually when an English speaker changes topic, his or her voice will lift considerably in pitch and in level of excitement. So that's a very important strategy to remember as well. And now we are going to review other important tips that you should remember during your test. You have to remember that when you're listening for the speaker, he or she can change his or her mind. The speaker often changes his or her mind and makes a correction before giving an answer that you need to write down in your answer sheet. So here we have an example from the authentic IELTS test. So as you see, you have a clerk saying a couple of sentences. So for example, he or she would say something like this: George, and you see the spelling of the last name. Good. Now, nationality, French. No, wait a minute, it is a Swiss passport. So as you see, the speaker in this case, he actually changed his mind from French, he went to Swiss passport. So you have to be very careful what kind of answer you can write down. So for example, you'll be given, for example, nationality and then blank. Then you would have to fill out with the right nationality here. Is that Swedish or French? In this case, that should be Swedish, correct response. On this slide, we are going to review how to practice for listening gap fills. Remember, gap fills tasks are the most difficult of the IELTS listening tasks. Your answer should be grammatically correct within the given sentences. So practice listening to the news either on the TV or radio and try to complete the chart below. As you see, we have a chart, and this is a good practice you can have at home. So for example, you can write down items, and maybe just gonna be one item, or maybe you want to practice more, so you can write down 3 or 4 items a day. So for example, here we have news item 1, and you have the following questions: what, where, when, who, how, and why. So listen to the news at home and then identify what happened, what the topic of the listening or the news, where it happened, for example, where it took a place, when, time of the day, maybe it's in the morning, in the evening, or you can also write down specific time, who did it, how it happened, and what's the reason for this situation. So this is a good way for you to practice your listening for specific and general information. IELTS Listening and Speaking: How to Improve Your Listening and Speaking Skills, Part 3. And now we are going to talk about speaking test tips and things you need to keep in mind before taking your test. First of all, remember to be prepared and try to relax. You should be on time and be prepared for your interview. Remember to have your passport with you to show the examiner for your identification. Remember also that this is a formal interview, not an ordinary conversation. So don't show up wearing flip-flops and your shorts. So make sure you are looking formal as well. The examiner cannot talk to you freely, so remember, she must follow a strict set of questions that were prepared in advance. Do not worry about the interview being recorded. It's a totally normal process. They have to be able to go back and listen to your speaking again. And remember, first impression is very important. You should always reply with an answer that is informative and interesting. And your body language is also important too. With your body language, aim to create relaxed and intelligent impression. So following these tips can be very helpful for you to attain a high score when you come to your interview. Be willing to talk and be positive. Do not simply reply yes or no to a question and wait for the next one. Remember, you are being tested for your speaking skill, so you have to make sure to speak as much as possible. Also, the examiner is there to guide you and will do as little of the talking as possible. So you should aim to speak 75 to 80% of the time. Also, be sensitive about some topics and avoid strong opinions, especially when you talk about government, religion, or related topics. You don't need to be 100% honest about everything, remember that too. The examiner just wants to hear how you speak English. And remember to be positive, interested, and respectful during your speaking test. In the IELTS exam, you'll be asked various questions. You have to make sure that you make good use of the questions that are being asked from you. If the situation was a regular conversation, it would be perfectly fine to say yes, no, okay, maybe, but this is not a regular conversation, but a formal IELTS interview. So in this case, if the examiner asks you the following questions such as, where do you come from? What's your favorite hobby? You have to make sure your response is complete. So for example, if your examiner will ask you, where do you come from? And you say Germany, it's not a great idea. So you have to make sure you give a complete response. For example, Germany, Hamburg, it is a north, a very busy city with a population over 1.5 million people. But actually, I live about 15 kilometers out of town on a small farm. As you see, this answer gives a lot of information and it's very complete, so that lets examiner to test your speaking ability, and that's what you should try to do. And now we are going to review things you should do and should not do during your IELTS exam. Things you should do are feeling relaxed, remaining in control right up until the moment you leave the interview room. And also it's a good idea if you shake your hand confidently, but you have to make sure that you are being invited to do so. And after that, thank your examiner for his or her time. You can simply say something like, thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed talking with you. And that's a good idea. Do not do the following things. For example, telling the examiner how relieved you are that the test is over. So you shouldn't do that. It's not a good idea. And also do not overdo your friendliness at the end. Be glad you did your best, smile, and leave the room. And also the most important point is not asking the examiner for your band score. He or she is unable to tell you that. So just be polite and friendly, but don't overdo your friendliness. As you remember, just thank your examiner, be positive, energetic, and try your best.